Friends, the video you're about to see was recorded on February 2nd this year, more than 5 months ago. But instead of posting it, I reached out to Conrad via email, and he responded 3 days later. So I'm quoting here verbatim. He said, "My intent was not to showcase the true and free as theologically pure. The true and free split away after 1928, underwent further theological development. But that wasn't the point of the sermon. The point of the sermon was that we, today, are facing the same kind of theological compromise from church leadership. I wasn't endorsing the Russian true and free for today. I was using them as historical example of what members are forced to do when the leadership compromise on core principles." I responded to that email with a challenge, and this is what I wrote. "I personally knew families who followed Shelkov. We did not hate them, nor were they persecuted instead of us. Official registered Adventists were also harassed, surveilled, publicly mocked, denied educational opportunities, forced into secrecy. Between 1960 and 1975, there was no registration available to any Adventist in the former Soviet Union. For those who chose to register, it did not mean collaboration. It meant collaboration for the sake of continued witness. And that's different. To frame the narrative primary as faithful dissidents versus compromised official church is historically inaccurate and deeply misleading. More importantly, Vladimir Shelkov was not a faithful reformer who later developed theological problems. He was a totalitarian sect leader. His movement functioned as a personality cult marked by unquestioned obedience, coercive control, shunning, and claims, explicit or implicit, of messianic status. I'm reading this because I want to read verbatim our correspondence. His followers referred to him as the mighty and glorious last forth triumphantly victorious other angel of Zion. That's just preposterous. That should alone disqualify him from being used as morally instructive example for the church today. To invoke Shelkov, even analogically, alongside the German Reform movement, or to represent him as a historic template for how believers should respond to perceived compromise today, is not only historically flawed, but pastorally dangerous. I challenge Conrad that the very example that he gives of Shelkov represents a system of control, not faithfulness. If some people admired Shelkov, that does not validate his movement any more than admiration some had for David Koresh or Viktor Khutiv. Popular devotion is not a reliable test of spiritual legitimacy. Conrad responded, but not answering, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. He left my challenges untouched. Now, the silence was notable because it communicated that he understands the danger of what he's doing. But instead, he reframed the issue by changing the question to, what should the faithful members do when leaders compromise? He doubled down on his Shelkov analogy, using it as a historical example of what members are forced to do when there's leadership compromise, repeating his arguments that events in Germany and Soviet Union are instructive to what should happen in North America today. Even as he says he's not endorsing the true and free movement, he continues using it as a model for contemporary response. He dismisses any correction on misrepresenting history, saying that let's focus on current compromise and today's crisis. Now, examples do matter, because a false historical analogy can legitimize unhealthy contemporary movements. I had written him 2 more letters, and he responded a week later. He provided his sources, and I searched and I found one of the books on internet, paid almost 200 Canadian to read it in context, and it is a rare book by Marite Sapiec. 300 pages later, highlighted and all that. It is far from being a history of Seventh-day Adventists in the Soviet Union. That's how it is titled, The Story of Seventh-day Adventists in the Soviet Union. It is the book about Shelkov and his offshoot. Conrad's response again pointed that he is changing the standard of evidence. He said in his email, "I'm less inclined to believe official sources than most other sources, and I'm more open to those who suffered persecution than to those who did not suffer such severe persecution." To me, that's funny, because the author did not suffer persecution. She was born in England to a Latvian family. Conrad was basically saying, I have a prior bias toward unofficial sources. And yes, official records couldn't be biased, but unofficial memoirs, oral traditions, and dissident movements are also biased. Good history has to compare both. Now, in his email, he said, I wasn't trying to rehabilitate Shelkov, but he does not say Shelkov was a cult leader, and I should not have used him. Instead, he moved the discussion to these were the sources I had. Now, I'm not going further into our correspondence, but I would rather give the reason why I'm publishing this. Over the past 5 months, Conrad has attacked the church, organizational principles, and biblical tithe. In his recent viral sermon, Entropy, he's suggesting to use tithe as a protest tool or redirected, further destabilizing the work organized for over a century. I was also concerned because other independent ministries and YouTubers used Shelkov, the one that Conrad introduced, as example of persecuted Adventists. Recently, Brother Lawrence's video, Adventist Persecution Happening in Kyrgyzstan, and James from Advent Media video, Police Raid on Seventh-day Adventists over reading materials, are continuing this trend of using an offshoot, cult followers, as example of worldwide Adventism. This is why I'm releasing this video, because rewriting history is dangerous. And I agree that system needs to be reformed, but destabilizing the church through untrue narratives will only cause damage to our church mission. Recently, I watched a presentation by Dr. Conrad Vine on Religious Liberty Weekend in Barron Springs, Michigan. And the title piqued my curiosity, True and Free Adventists. See, that's how extreme breakaway group in former Soviet Union called themselves. And so imagine my shock when I start watching it and I realized that he has rewritten history and superimposed his ideas on history to project this alternative movement within Adventism as some future hope for the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now, many got excited about the last 15 minutes of his presentation when he was drawing comparisons between the official Seventh-day Adventist Church and the true and free version. And there's been a lot of videos recorded already analyzing this and all that, but I got shocked by how he built up to it. See, before making his predictions of standoff between the official church and so-called free and true, he spent 54 minutes telling stories from the former Soviet Union, where, according to him, some true and free Adventists carried the seeds of truth. I've written to him personally, sent 2 emails, and posted a comment under the video. I noticed in the comments that some call him our Bonhoeffer, and even some Russian-speaking are affirming the true and free. Now, that shocked me even more. I hope that by now, some leaders of Russian-speaking post-Soviet Adventist would speak up on this, because he called Vladimir Shelkov, the leader of True and Free, as a big example for Adventism. Now, I'm recording this short video to invite you to examine facts rather than be mesmerized by history that is being remade. Watch this video clip.
Andrei Sakharov fought for that 83-year-old man. The General Conference did not fight for that 83-year-old man, but Andrei Sakharov did. And that old man, he was sentenced almost immediately to 5 years in a strict labor camp in northern Siberia. A couple of months later, in the tundra of Siberia, his body gave out. His race had been run. He had fought the good fight. He'd kept the faith. But who was that old man? You You see his picture on the screen, a name that is mostly lost to Western Adventists today. Some of you are familiar with him. His name was Vladimir Shelkov. He was born in 1895. He was arrested by Stalin's secret police in 1931, and he was confined to labor camps for most of his adult life. He was a leader of what they called at the time the True and Free Adventists.
I'm putting these clips that you see direct statements, that I'm not paraphrasing something. This assertion that Vladimir Shelkov was a Seventh-day Adventist who carried the truth while the official church was compromised, that is a blatant lie. Shelkov was a totalitarian sect leader. To promote Shelkov would be the same as to promote Viktor Hutiev, who started Shepherd's Rod, or Vernon Howell, known also as David Koresh, who led that standoff with FBI in Texas in 1993. These people do not represent the Seventh-day Adventist Church at all. I grew up in a former Soviet Union, and I personally knew people who belonged to that movement. We call them Shelkovцы. And Conrad makes a statement that official Adventists hated them. No, we did not hate them. We felt embarrassed by them because they did not represent the values of Christ's character. Yes, they stood against the Soviet regime, but with that came a lot of deception. With that came a lot of strange ideas. I'm not even speaking about strange theology. This is not about Shelkov. Now, within Seventh-day Adventist movement in former Soviet Union, there was an official church, the Seventh-day Adventist. There was a Seventh-day Adventist reform movement. And then there were followers of Shelkov. The official Seventh-day Adventists were also persecuted. Now, I'm not here to tell my story of persecution. This is not about me. This is about the statement that makes Shelkov somehow an example for free and true Adventism. See, when I grew older, I've learned about Shelkov's followers. And I've heard from some people who were in that sect stories about the double tithe demands, about confession of sins on recordings, and shunning and isolation of those who questioned the system after Shelkov died. Shelkov served 3 terms in Soviet Gulag, in concentration camps there. But he also brought that prison culture with him into his sect. His followers believed he was the incarnation of Christ. It was a personality cult. This is how leaders after him were titled: the mighty and glorious, last, fourth, general, triumphantly victorious other angel of Zion, the anointed one and chairman of the Church of the Faithful. Now, this is English translation of the Russian title used. This video is not about Shelkov even. It is about the history being manipulated to serve the personal agenda of contemporary influential leader. Conrad also mentions name of Teofil Babienko. And in doing so, he again makes certain historical assertions that make me question, why do you mention Babienko?
There were over 100 delegates in attendance. One of them was a man called Teofil Babienko. He was a convert from Stavropol, just north of the Caucasus today. He was ordained as an elder, and he was sent off to pastor a Russian church, but he was immediately arrested and sent by the Tsarist authorities to the other side of the Caucasus Mountains.
Teofil Babienko, we say in our language, Theophil. He was not a convert from Stavropol. He actually was from Ukraine, from Tarasha, south of Kiev, the same village where my father was born and raised and grew up, and where I would visit my aunt and my grandma. He was sent to Stavropol into exile for the work that he was already doing in Ukraine. Later on, he would immigrate to Romania and then to Canada, and he was instrumental in Canada since 1903, starting Russian and Ukrainian-speaking churches in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Now, his son, Theofil Theofilovich Babienko, he would serve as ordained minister of the Seventh-day Adventist official church. He would work as a pastor in Saskatchewan, then he was sent to China, where he established many Russian-speaking congregations in East China, Manchuria region. Harbin was the Russian-speaking Chinese city. In 1928, Theophil Jr. Babienko, he was elected to serve as a president of Baltic Union. He founded a theological seminary near Riga. And then from 1932, he served as the president of Polish Union, establishing the work in Western Ukraine and Belarus. In 1936, Theophil Jr. Babienko, Theophil Theophilovich Babienko, was elected to serve as the secretary of Northern European Division. He worked and served all his life in the official Seventh-day Adventist Church. Why refer to him while introducing this history of persecuted, true and free puzzles me. I'm not sure why Babienko's name is even mentioned. And then Conrad asserts that the true and free flourished.
But despite this persecution, the true and frees flourished. They didn't just survive, they flourished. The more intense the Soviet persecution, the more the true and the frees were aggressive in their evangelism. They established printing presses from Vladivostok all the way west to Russia and then west into Belarusia and south into Ukraine. They distributed Adventist literature all across the Soviet Union, and the Soviets kept trying to find the source of this literature, but they couldn't find it. They taught their faith to their children, which was illegal under the Soviet Union. They ran local charitable ministries. They ran underground house churches. They refused to swear oaths of allegiance to the Soviet state, and they refused to send their children to school on the Sabbath day.
This is so far from the truth. At the fall of Soviet Union, the official Seventh-day Adventist Church was numbering nearly 40,000 believers. Shelkov's followers were not even 1/10 of it. Some estimate probably 8,000, but again, there's no confirmed numbers because it was a secret society. There's no statistics, there's no records, and people tend to exaggerate and self-promote their numbers. Now, here's an interesting thing. There is plenty of evidence that followers of Shelkov collaborated with government authorities when it fit their interests. Also, they collaborated with foreign intelligence agencies when it suited their own interests. Now, I brought with me a book on set. It's written by Anatoly Andreevich Debunking. And so he writes, and I'm opening to page 160, and I'm translating from Russian. By the way, the book is titled The Seventh-day Adventist Christian Church and Reform Movements. And so he's addressing Shelkov in this book on a few occasions. But here's an interesting statement. Debunking writes, Shelkov, while accusing the Church of sin for its relationships with the state and appealing for help, himself surpassed the official church in this by seeking assistance from dissidents, from United States President Jimmy Carter, and even from the Pope of Rome. How about that? For someone who was free and true and did not collaborate with government. The official church chose to cooperate, not collaborate, but cooperate with the government only as far as conscience allowed in order to preserve open witness rather than to become a dissident movement. I grew up in the official, registered church, and we also had to hide. Baptisms were often conducted at night in a secret places where no one knew where we're going to conduct a baptism so the KGB and police would not find out. I once witnessed a preacher escaping through the window in a house church while the deacons were holding the police officers, who call them militia, at the door. And so finally, there's this claim that I must address too, that somehow Neal Wilson issued an ultimatum to the true and free in 1979, cutting them out completely from the picture.
Well, Elder Neal Wilson was the president of the General Conference. You see his picture on the screen. He personally took control of building a functional relationship with the authorities of the USSR. I guess the idea was if we engage positively with these people, we can help them move in the right direction. I guess that was the general idea. Elder Wilson penned an open letter to the Soviet Adventists in 19 79. And this is the letter here. And he said this: the General Conference can recognize only one Seventh-day Adventist organization in any country. This would normally be the one recognized by the authorities. We encourage all who consider themselves to be Seventh-day Adventists to identify with the recognized body of believers. Interpretation: if you're in the true and frees, you're on your own. We want nothing to do with you. We will work with the official Adventist church, who send their children to school on Sabbath, etc., but we will have nothing to do with the true and frees who are upholding the Sabbath and refusing to break the fourth and the sixth commandments.
This is not true at all. Those Shelkovцы, followers of Shelkov, were not Neal Wilson's concern at all. The Adventist Church lost its organized status. What they call SASD was deregistered in 1960. And in that vacuum of organized church, there emerged two centers, one in Moscow and one in Kiev. I'm holding here another book. It's 2 volumes, The History of Seventh-day Adventist Church in Russia. There's a chapter that literally calls these years from 1961 to 1981 «Годы междоусобиц». If I'm to translate, these are the years of internal strife. You see, by 1970s, different individual churches would seek to be organized and registered that they may hold property. Now, I grew up in unregistered church. I remember myself as a child until about the age of 10, meeting in house churches in someone's living room. But by the late 1970s, many churches were registered, but again, there's still no organization. Now, the 52nd session of General Conference was held in Vienna, Austria. And that location was chosen on purpose to give an opportunity for the delegates from the socialist bloc of countries to attend, and it was successful. 2 leaders were elected to serve on the General Conference Executive Committee. One was from Moscow, Kulakov, and one was from Kiev, Parasey. Now, within Ukraine, there are also divisions. There was division between Matsanov in the east in Kharkiv and Parasey, who was in the center in Kiev. I remember him as a preacher. I remember him as a minister. And I remember that the big conflict was about the communion, because Parasey promoted the open communion and suggested the use of individual cups instead of one big cup that everyone would have to drink from. And there are many other groups. There are followers of Kolbach and Dimon, and more names could be mentioned. By 1979, Zhukaluk from the west region from Lviv replaced Matsanov, who was from the east from Kharkiv. But Ukraine still remained divided into spheres of influence. Even in 1980, in Dallas, Texas, at the next General Conference, Ukrainian delegation had 3 official representatives: Zhukaluk, Parasey, and Panchenko, representing those rival factions and perhaps a neutral party. And so the official Seventh-day Adventist registered church in the former Soviet Union was itself divided into regional followings. As I mentioned already, groups associated with Matsanov, Dimon, Parasey, Kolbach, Zhukaluk, and then Kulakov in Russia. When Neal Wilson issued that letter, an appeal, he was appealing to the official Seventh-day Adventists to work in unity. He did not mention Shelkov. He did not even mean that breakaway group. Now, Vine mentions in the video that Shelkov's name is not in the annals of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and I say, praise God. His name should not be in the annals of our church. Neither should David Koresh be there or Victor Hutev, perhaps in a negative side note of people who disrupted and distorted the Adventist witness. I'm not even mentioning his faulty theology. He was more than offshoot. He was used by the enemy of God, pretending to be an angel of light. Now, for the fact that Sakharov spoke highly of him, well, those who were against the Soviet regime supported one another as comrades. Now, I don't intend to give 54 minutes historical lecture on Adventism in the former Soviet Union. I may record some additional videos. My appeal is simple. Those who listen to Conrad Vine should not accept his claims uncritically, but should examine the facts. What Conrad Vine is promoting is not free movement, but an alternative organization modeled on control. The very example he cites, Vladimir Shelkov, represents a system of total control, totalitarian authority over people. He distorts history to legitimize his vision of rival movement and then injects it with hostility and suspicion. This path will not lead to renewal or reform. It will only cause fracture among church members. It would not strengthen our mission. Whenever a movement separates to start something supposedly pure, Satan will work to bring the tares, and those who think they're weed, they also would be infiltrated, and that organization would become even more messed up and corrupt. I'm picking up again this book by Anatoly Andreevich Debunking, and on page 141, he is quoting from an epistle, a letter from 1997, written by these true and free so-called Adventists, where they are decrying the abominations that exist within their own denomination. You see, whenever we think that we're going to create a pure organization, that objective of establishing all faithful new church movement will fail when God is not in it. And so my final thing is, for those who respect and take seriously advice given by Ellen White, one of our church founders, please consider these words. I read from Testimonies, Volume 9, pages 257 to 259. The spirit of pulling away from fellow laborers, the spirit of disorganization, is in the very air we breathe. By some, all efforts to establish order are regarded as dangerous, as a restriction of personal liberty, and hence to be feared as popery. These deceived souls regard it a virtue to boast of their freedom to think and act independently. They declare that they will not take any man's say-so, that they are amenable to no man. I have been instructed, she writes, that it is Satan's special effort to lead men to feel that God is pleased to have them choose their own course independent of the course of their brethren. If men will not move in concert in a great and grand work for this time, there will be confusion. It is not a good sign when men refuse to unite with their brethren and prefer to act alone. When I read this paragraph, to me it describes what's happening right now by some leaders challenging the official organized Seventh-day Adventist church. Does system need improvement? Yes. It has been reorganized in 1901, and perhaps it needs more reorganizing for mission. But there should be no calls to division. Some workers pull with all the power that God has given them, but they have not yet learned that they should not pull alone. Instead of isolating themselves, let them draw in harmony with their fellow laborers. Unless they do this, their activity will work at the wrong time and in the wrong way. They will often work counter to that which God would have done, and thus their work is worse than wasted. She writes in Selected Messages, Volume 2, page 397, I am instructed to say to Seventh-day Adventists the world over, God has appointed that His church on earth shall stand perfectly united in the spirit and counsel of the Lord of hosts to the end of time. Friends, the unity of the church is the convincing evidence that God has sent Jesus into the world as its Redeemer. When I look at the history and how it's been misinterpreted and misrepresented, I begin to question if this is another deception organized to deceive the elect. So I invite you, friends, study your history, know your history, and speak up when you see that the wrong examples are given. Shelkov should not be presented as some kind of model of the true and free movement rising within Adventism, no more than David Koresh or Viktor Hutiev or any other breakaway groups. Even now, in this social media environment, there exist a lot of YouTubers who may not even represent the official Seventh-day Adventist Church, but all they do is criticize and pick on the church. They make their business of literally finding the faults with the church and putting them out there. There has been a prophecy in Gospel of Matthew chapter 24, spoken by Jesus. And there is an interesting verse, 28. For wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. Perhaps I should paraphrase, wherever the rotten corpse is, there will be vultures picking on it. And so, whenever a ministry has only one purpose, to pick and pick on whatever may need correction in the church, that's a vulture ministry. Whenever we look into the future, we must remember how God has led us in the past and not rewrite the history to suit some of our own personal agendas. The church must stay united until Jesus comes. Friends, reform must never be built on distorted history. When we choose the wrong heroes, we eventually choose the wrong direction. History is not merely a collection of interesting stories. It shapes our identity. It shapes how we understand the present, and it shapes the future we're willing to create. If we portray authoritarian sect leaders as models of faithfulness simply because they opposed a corrupt system, we risk teaching the next generation that separation itself is a virtue and that every independent movement is evidence of God's blessing. It is not. Study the sources, verify historic claims, do not accept any speaker, including me, without examining the evidence. And above all, remember that our mission is not to build competing movements. It is to proclaim Jesus, prepare the world for his soon return, and strengthen the church until he comes. Thank you for watching.